The first Albert Covington knew of trouble was the creak of the barn door he had oiled not 3 days before, swinging open when no wind stirred to move it. He came off his cot in the back room of the smithy, with the tallow candle still smoking in his fingers, and he crossed the yard in his shirt sleeves with a horseshoe rasp gripped like a weapon, because a blacksmith kept few guns but plenty of iron, and iron would do in a pinch. The night was clear and cold, the kind of brilliant autumn night that came to the Cascade foothills before the rains found their way down from the peaks, and the stars over Cedar Falls burned sharp as struck sparks. He smelled wood smoke from the town below and hay, and something else beneath it, blood. He found the boy first, crouched at the base of the ladder to the hayloft with an armful of Albert's clean bandaging cloth and a jar of the liniment he sold to loggers for their aching backs. The boy could not have been more than 15, thin as a fence post, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat despite the cold. "Put your hands where I can see them," Albert said, low and even, the way he had learned long ago to speak to men who might do something foolish if startled. The boy did not run. That told Albert something right away. A true thief ran. This one stood his ground, chin up, shaking, and said, "Mister, I know what this looks like, and I'll pay you back every cent, but there's a man dying in your loft and I didn't have time to knock on your door proper." Albert climbed the ladder himself, rasp still in hand, and found a second figure laid out in the straw, a young man not much older than the boy, his shirt dark and stiff with old blood at the shoulder, his face gray as ash. The stranger's eyes fluttered open at the lantern light and he tried to sit up, failed, and cursed softly through his teeth. "He's Warren," the boy said from the ladder, climbing up behind. "Warren Michaels. He rides for the Ellsworth spread. Somebody put a bullet in him out past the north fence 2 nights back, and he's been hiding in the timber since, afraid to come in for the doctor because of what he saw." "What did he see?" Albert asked, already tearing the shirt away from the wound to look at it properly. It was a graze deep enough to fester but not deep enough to have killed him outright, and it had gone untended too long. "Men cutting the boundary fence," Warren said, his voice a thread. "Not Hargrove men. I know every hand Cyrus Hargrove keeps, known them since I was small, and I never seen these fellows before in my life. But when I went to stop them, one put a rifle on me from the tree line before I ever got close enough to see a face plain, and I've been laying up scared half the county would call me a liar or a fool if I said it wasn't Hargrove's doing." Albert Covington had spent enough years around men with secrets to know the shape of a true one when he heard it. He worked through the night by lantern light, cleaning the wound with carbolic soap and stitching it closed with the same steady hands he used to draw hot iron into shoe and hinge, while the boy, whose name turned out to be Danny, held the lantern and did not flinch once, and told Albert in a rush of words that Danny had no people of his own since the log slide took his mother and father 2 winters back, and that Mrs. Ellsworth had taken him on to sweep the bunkhouse and mind the horses because nobody else in Cedar Falls had room in their house or their heart for one more mouth. "She's good to you," Albert said, more statement than question. "She's good to everybody who works honest," Danny said, "which is why I couldn't let Warren die scared in the woods rather than come tell her what he saw." By the time the sky had gone the color of a healing bruise over the eastern ridge, Albert had made his decision. He hitched his mule to the flatbed cart he used for hauling scrap iron, laid Warren on a bed of clean straw and horse blankets, and set out with Danny walking alongside for the 4 miles of rutted timber road that led to the Ellsworth ranch house, because a wounded man and a frightened boy needed more than a blacksmith's barn could give them, and because something in him, something that had gone quiet and careful since he had come west to Cedar Falls 3 years before, told him this was not a morning to mind his own business and let another man's trouble pass him by. The Ellsworth ranch sat in a wide bend of the river valley where the timber opened into good grass. The house itself, a solid 2-story structure of milled lumber with a wraparound porch that Thomas Ellsworth had built the year before a fever took him, leaving his widow to run 4,000 acres of cattle range with a foreman who had known her husband longer than he had known her, and a crew of hired hands who were not yet certain what to make of a woman giving the orders. Elsie Ellsworth was standing on that porch drying her hands on her apron when the cart came rattling up the lane, and she was down the steps and across the yard before Albert had even drawn the mule to a stop, because she knew Danny's gait even at a distance, the particular hurried lope of a boy who had learned young that trouble did not wait for you to walk to it properly. "That's Warren Michaels in your cart," she said, not a question, already climbing up onto the wheel hub to look. She had a face that might have been called plain by some and handsome by anyone with sense enough to look twice, sun-browned and unpowdered, with pale gray eyes that took in the whole of a situation in one sweep and did not waste time being shocked by it. "Somebody shot him 2 nights back by his account," Albert said, swinging down off the seat. "Along your north fence line. He says it wasn't Hargrove men who did the cutting he went out to stop." "I know your face," Elsie said, studying him now with the same quick assessment. "You're the Smith, Covington. Albert Covington, ma'am. Well, Mr. Covington, you've done my hand a kindness I won't forget, and now I expect you'd best come inside, because I have a feeling this morning is not going to be a short one." It was not. The bunkhouse crew gathered on the porch within the hour, drawn by the sight of Warren being carried in on a plank door taken off its hinges for a stretcher, and by the time the ranch's aging foreman, Garrett Voss, came striding up from the corrals with his hat already off and his face already thunderous, half the crew already believed Hargrove had finally done what everyone had feared since the first fence post turned up cut a month before. "I want the crew mounted and armed within the hour," Garrett said, not to Elsie at first but past her to the men behind her, the way he had spoken to Thomas Ellsworth's hired hands for 11 years before Thomas had ever married. "We ride the boundary, and we settle this the way it should have been settled the first time a Hargrove steer wandered onto our grass." "No," Elsie said. The word came out plain and quiet, but it landed on that porch like a dropped anvil. Garrett Voss turned to look at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I don't believe you understand what's at stake here. A man's been shot." "I understand it a great deal better than you think, Garrett, because it's my ranch and my hand lying in there with a hole in his shoulder, and I will tell you exactly what we are going to do about it. We are not riding onto Hargrove land with rifles across our saddles like it's Independence Day, and we've got scores to settle. Warren says plain as anything that the men who did this weren't Hargrove's crew. I believe him, because Warren Michaels has ridden this range 4 years and never once told me a lie I could find. So instead of starting a shooting war with our neighbors on the strength of one man's fear in the dark, we are going to pull every hand off the north fence line until we know more, move the herd to the south pasture where it's safer, and I want 2 men digging a proper firebreak trench along the timber edge before this dry weather turns, because if somebody is cutting fence and shooting at my riders, the last thing I intend to hand them is an easy way to burn me out besides." Garrett Voss's face had gone the color of a brick left too long in the kiln. "With respect, ma'am, your husband would never have stood by while men shot at his crew." "My husband is dead, Garrett," Elsie said, and something moved behind her eyes that was not weakness, though it cost her plainly to say it so flat. "And I am not interested in running this ranch the way a dead man might have. I am interested in running it in a way that keeps the rest of my people breathing. If that is not work you can do under my orders, I understand, and I will write you a fair reference myself. But I will not have my crew riding to their deaths over an assumption." The porch went very quiet. Somewhere behind the house a rooster crowed, absurdly cheerful against the tension hanging in the yard. "I've given 11 years to this outfit," Garrett said finally, low and rough. "I'll not be ordered about by—" He stopped himself, though the unspoken word hung there plain enough for everyone. "By a woman," Elsie finished for him without flinching. "Say it if you mean it, Garrett. I'd rather have the truth of a man's objection than his silence." Garrett Voss said nothing more. He turned on his heel, spat once into the dirt, and stalked back toward the corrals, muttering something about men who ought to have better sense than to work for a widow's whims, loud enough to be heard and not quite loud enough to be called insubordination outright. Two of the older hands drifted after him, uncertain, caught between old loyalty and new orders. It was Albert Covington who moved first among the rest. North fence pulled back, herd to the south pasture, firebreak dug along the timber line, he said, as though reciting it back to be sure he had it right, and then, without waiting for anyone else to decide whether they agreed, he walked to the corral, took up a shovel leaning against the tack shed wall, and started toward the timber edge on foot, because he had come in a cart and had no horse of his own saddled yet. Elsie watched him go for a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Covington," he stopped, turned back. "You don't work for this ranch." "No, ma'am, I don't." "Then why are you carrying my shovel toward my fence line?" Albert considered the question with the same care he gave to a piece of iron before he struck it, weighing where the heat needed to go. "Because you gave an order that made sense, and there weren't but a few hands left standing here willing to follow it," he said. "Seemed like somebody ought to." Something shifted in Elsie Ellsworth's face then, something that was not quite a smile but stood very close to one. "I can't pay a wage that will keep a smithy running, Mr. Covington." "Didn't ask for one," Albert said. "I'll shoe your horses and mend your gate hinges same as I always have, and I'll dig your fire break in the mornings and evenings besides, until Warren's back on his feet and you've got hands enough again. Call it a neighbor's debt paid for the use of my barn last night, if you'd rather not call it charity." "I don't take charity," Elsie said, "and I don't much care for debts I can't square either. So we'll call it wages, small as they'll have to be, and you'll take them, or you can put that shovel back where you found it." "Yes, ma'am," Albert said, and something in the plain, unhesitating ease of those two words settled into Elsie Ellsworth like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she did not yet have a name for. That was how Albert Covington became, in the space of one gray autumn morning, both the blacksmith of Cedar Falls and the newest hand on the Ellsworth ranch, a man with a foot in two worlds who would soon find both of them burning. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that suited Albert better than he expected. He rose before the sun to walk or ride the 4 miles out to the ranch, worked 2 hours at the firebreak trench or mending fence before the light was even good and honest, then rode back to open his smithy for the loggers and teamsters and ferrymen who kept Cedar Falls fed and moving, and returned again in the long gold hour before dark to see what the day's orders had been and whether they had held. Cedar Falls was not a large town, but it sat at a crossing that made it matter far beyond its size. The river ferry that carried timber downstream to the mills, the log road that fed the ferry, the ranches and homesteads scattered up the valley that depended on both. Without a smith to shoe the draft teams and mend the ferry's iron fittings and repair the endless broken tools of a logging economy, the whole valley would have ground slowly to a halt, and every soul in it knew it, which was part of why Silas Rourke, who owned the mercantile and held notes on half the property in the valley, had never managed to run Albert Covington out of business the way he had run off 2 previous smiths who would not extend him the same easy credit terms he liked to offer everyone else. Terms that always seemed to come due at the worst possible moment. Albert did not think much about Silas Rourke in those first weeks. He thought about the wound on Warren Michael's shoulder, which healed clean under Elsie's daily changing of the dressing. He thought about Danny, who took to following Albert around the smithy on Sunday afternoons, asking questions about tempering steel with the same hunger he brought to everything. A boy starved for someone steady to stand near. And he thought, more than he meant to, about Elsie Ellsworth, who fed her crew 3 solid meals a day from her own kitchen, because she had once been the ranch's cook herself before she was its owner, and who could still be found elbow-deep in a pot of stew at dusk, even after a full day of riding fence and settling disputes, and doing sums by lamplight to keep the ranch solvent. "You don't have to cook for us," Albert told her one evening, the third week of his working there, as she set a plate in front of him at the long bunkhouse table without being asked. "You've got 100 other things pulling at you. I know what I have to do and what I choose to do, Mr. Covington, and I'd thank you to let me keep the distinction clear in my own head," Elsie said. But there was no sting in it, only the particular dry humor he had begun to recognize as her way of letting a man know she liked him without saying so outright. "Besides, a crew that eats well works better and complains less. My husband used to say I ran this kitchen like a general ran a campaign." "Sounds about right," Albert said, and earned himself a look that might have been half offended and half pleased. It was Garrett Voss who remained the sore joint in an otherwise mending arm. He had not quit, not yet, though he made his displeasure known in a dozen small ways. A curt nod instead of a greeting, orders given to the other hands that skirted just close enough to Elsie's instructions to avoid outright defiance while making his opinion of them plain. He watched Albert with a particular narrow suspicion. The look of a man who had decided a stranger's usefulness did not excuse the stranger's presumption in taking up space that had once belonged, in Garrett's mind, to men who had earned their place through years rather than a single night's kindness. "You'll not last the winter here, Smith," Garrett told him one gray morning as they worked opposite ends of the same fence line, close enough to talk, far enough to pretend they weren't. "A man can't run a forge and a ranch both, not through a Cascade winter. You'll pick one or the other, same as every man does eventually." "Maybe," Albert said, driving a staple into a post with 3 clean strokes. "Or maybe I'll manage both a while longer and surprise you." "I've buried better men than you under worse winters than the one coming," Garrett said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat certainty of a man who had watched the valley long enough to trust its patterns over any newcomer's optimism. "This valley chews up men who try to be 2 things at once. You ought to pick before it picks for you." Albert said nothing to that, because there was a part of him, quiet and old and careful, that agreed. He had spent years being only one thing after another, changing his name to no name at all in his own head, letting the forge fire burn away whatever he had been before he came to Cedar Falls, and the notion of being 2 things again, of being needed in 2 places by people who might come to depend on him staying, frightened him more than he cared to admit even to himself. The trouble did not wait long to remind everyone why patience mattered more than pride. 9 days after Warren Michaels was carried up onto the Ellsworth porch on a plank door, 2 more sections of fence turned up cut along the western boundary the Ellsworth range shared with Cyrus Hargrove's land, and this time 6 head of cattle wearing the Ellsworth brand were found grazing calm as you please on Hargrove grass, driven there, plainly, by someone who wanted the theft to look like a deliberate trespass rather than an accident of open fence. Cyrus Hargrove rode over himself to deliver the news. A broad, weathered man near 60 with a son, Nathaniel, trailing behind him on a nervous chestnut gelding, young and quick to anger in the particular way of a man who has grown up hearing his father's grievances repeated at the supper table until they became his own. "I don't want trouble between us, Mrs. Ellsworth," Cyrus said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands out of old-fashioned courtesy, though his voice carried none of the warmth the gesture implied. "I knew your Thomas, and I liked him well enough, God rest him. But I've got cut fence on my side too, going back 2 months now, and calves gone missing that I can't account for, and it's getting harder every week to believe it's all just bad luck." "It isn't bad luck," Elsie said. "It's somebody with a reason to want both our outfits looking guilty of something, and I don't believe for 1 minute it's either of us doing the cutting." "Then who?" Nathaniel Hargrove said, sharp from behind his father. "Because it surely looks like your cattle wandering onto our grass, ma'am, and it surely was your hand out on our boundary at night not 2 weeks back, whatever story he tells about who shot him." "Careful, boy," Garrett Voss said, stepping up beside Elsie with a look that suggested some part of him, whatever his objections to Elsie's other orders, was not about to stand for a Hargrove calling any Ellsworth man a liar in this yard. Albert had been mending a hinge on the tack shed door when the Hargroves rode in, and he set down his tools and came to stand near enough to hear, saying nothing, watching the way tempers on both sides balanced on a blade's edge that a single careless word could tip either way. "Nobody's calling anybody a liar who hasn't earned it," Cyrus Hargrove said, laying a hand on his son's arm without looking at him, the small automatic gesture of a father used to reigning in a hot temper. "But you understand my position, ma'am. My crew is asking me why we keep losing stock and taking fence damage while nothing seems to touch the Ellsworth spread the same way, and I don't have a good answer for them." "We've lost stock too," Elsie said, "and a man shot. I don't call that nothing touching us." "Then let's find who's doing it together before either of our crews decides to settle it their own way," Cyrus said, and something in the plain reasonableness of that, offered despite his son's obvious appetite for a fight, told Albert that Cyrus Hargrove was a decent man caught in a bad situation, much as Elsie was. They agreed, standing in that yard, to a wary truce. No retaliation, a joint patrol of the shared boundary by one rider from each outfit, and a promise to bring any evidence found straight to each other rather than to guns. Nathaniel Hargrove looked unhappy about it the whole while, but he held his tongue at his father's continued grip on his arm, and the two Hargrove men rode off in the long shadows of late afternoon, leaving an uneasy peace behind them. "That won't hold," Garrett said, watching them go. "Not if this keeps happening." "Then we'd better find who's doing it before it happens again," Elsie said, and turned to look at Albert with an idea already forming behind her eyes. "Mr. Covington, you shoe half the horses in this valley. Would you know a shoe you'd set yourself out of a print in soft ground?" Albert considered it. "Depends on the ground and how fresh the print is, but yes, ma'am, generally I would. I use a particular nail pattern on account of an old habit, and there's not another smith within 20 miles who sets a shoe the way I do." "Then tomorrow," Elsie said, "you're going to walk that cut fence line with me before anyone else muddies the ground, and you're going to tell me whose horses have been standing where they oughtn't." It was, in its way, the first time Elsie Ellsworth asked Albert Covington to do something not because he had offered, but because she had thought of him specifically, of his particular skill, as the answer to a problem no one else could solve, and the quiet pride that rose in his chest at being needed for exactly what he was, rather than in spite of it, surprised him with its force. They rode the fence line together at first light the next morning, just the two of them, leaving Garrett to manage the crew and the gather. The autumn colors had come on hard and bright that year, the vine maple gone crimson along the creek bottoms, the big leaf maples above them shedding gold onto ground still soft from a wee cold rain, and beneath the brilliance of it, Albert found himself more aware than he wanted to be of Elsie riding easy beside him, her hands sure on the reins, her eyes constantly moving, reading the land the way he read a piece of iron for its flaws. They found the cut section of fence easily enough, the wire snipped clean and rolled back rather than simply broken, the work of someone patient and unhurried. In the soft mud near the fence post, half obscured by the churned tracks of the Hargrove crew who had already ridden through investigating, Albert found what he was looking for, a single clear print, 4 shoes visible in a scuffed circle where a horse had stood still a while, and the nail pattern in that print was not his own. "Whoever set that shoe learned it somewhere east," Albert said, crouching to study it. "See how the nails run high on the outside branch? That's a Missouri pattern mostly. I don't set a shoe that way, and neither does the smith over in concrete, far as I've ever seen his work. This is a horse that's come from somewhere else, or been shod by somebody passing through." "Or somebody Rourke brought in," Elsie said, half to herself, and when Albert looked at her she was frowning at the print as though it had personally offended her. "He's done it before, hiring drifters for a season when he wants extra hands moving freight or clearing timber for one of his side ventures. If he's got men on his payroll nobody in the valley recognizes, You think Rourke's behind this?" Albert asked, though something in him had already begun turning the same thought over since the day before, some old instinct for the shape of a scheme that came from years he did not like to remember. "I think Silas Rourke holds the note on half the Hargrove range and a good third of mine, and I think a man who profits every time either of us falls behind on a payment has more reason than any Hargrove or Ellsworth to want us both weak and distracted and fighting each other instead of watching him," Elsie said. "But thinking it and proving it are different animals, Mr. Covington, and I'll not accuse a man in this valley of something so low without proof solid enough to hang it on." Albert nodded slowly and found himself saying, before he had quite decided to say it, "I know a little something about men who profit off other men's ruin. Worked for one once, a long time back before I ever came west to Cedar Falls." Elsie turned in her saddle to look at him fully, and there was no judgment in her face, only a steady, careful attention that felt somehow more searching than judgment would have been. "You've never once spoken of your life before you came here." "No, ma'am, I haven't. Are you going to?" The question hung there in the cold, bright morning air, and Albert found that he wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything in 3 careful years, to answer it honestly. But the words stuck in his throat like a green log that would not take flame, and after a long moment he said only, "Not today." "If that's not enough for you, I understand it." "It isn't enough," Elsie said plainly without cruelty. "But I've learned patience, running a ranch full of men who none of them tell me the whole truth the first time asked. I'll wait, Mr. Covington. I won't wait forever, but I'll wait long enough to see whether the waiting's worth it." They said little else on the ride back, but something had shifted between them, a door left slightly open where before there had been only a wall, and Albert rode back toward Cedar Falls that afternoon turning her words over and over, wondering how much of himself he could afford to give a woman who required the whole truth before she would give her trust in return, and wondering, too, whether he had it in him to be that honest with anyone, even himself. The weeks that followed brought no fresh violence, only a low, simmering unease, as though the whole valley held its breath. The joint boundary patrol found nothing more than old tracks and fresh suspicion. Warren Michaels healed enough to take light duty again, though he still favored his left arm, and he told anyone who would listen that he had seen at least one of the men cutting fence wearing a coat with a distinctive brass button, the kind sold in exactly one place in the valley, Rourke's Mercantile. It was Danny, in the end, who brought the clearest thread to follow, though he did it in the way of boys everywhere, by being somewhere he had no particular business being and keeping his ears open. He had gone to the Mercantile on an errand for Elsie, a list of flour and salt and coffee to be charged against the ranch's account, and while he waited for Rourke's clerk to fill the order he had wandered toward the back storeroom looking for a barrel of horseshoe nails he'd been asked to fetch a sample of for Albert. And there, through a crack in a door left carelessly ajar, he had seen a man he did not recognize, rough-dressed, counting a stack of coin into his palm, while Silas Rourke himself watched with the particular satisfied stillness of a man closing a transaction he did not want witnessed. "That's the last of it till after the gather," Rourke had said, low, though not so low a sharp-eared boy pressed against a doorframe could not hear it. "I want both outfits looking to their neighbors for blame a while longer yet. Once they've spent themselves fighting each other over cattle and fence, they'll come to me quick enough for the paper to keep their land, and I'll have terms ready that neither of them will love but both will sign, because desperate men always sign." Danny had backed away before he was seen, and it was only that evening, breathless with the telling of it at the Ellsworth supper table, that Albert and Elsie and Garrett Voss himself heard the whole of what the boy had overheard. Garrett was the first to speak into the silence that followed. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, stiff, plainly finding the words difficult. "I thought this was Hargrove trouble, plain and simple, same as my guts told me for a month, and I was ready to ride to war on the strength of my own stubbornness. If the boy heard right, it was never Hargrove trouble at all." "No," Elsie said. "It never was. What do we do with what the boy heard?" Garrett asked. "It's a boy's word against a mercantile owner's, and Rourke's got more friends among the county officials than either of our outfits, being as he holds notes on half of them too, I'd wager. We do what my husband would have called building a case instead of a grievance," Elsie said. "We find the man Danny saw taking payment. We match his horse to that print along the fence line. We find out where Rourke's hired drifters have been bunking and whether anyone else in town has seen them. And we do it quiet, and we do it together, all three outfits, mine and Hargrove's both, because Rourke's whole scheme only works so long as we're too busy hating each other to look at him." It was Albert who rode to the Hargrove ranch the next morning to deliver that message, alone, because Elsie judged, rightly, that a message carried by a stranger to both feuds might be heard with less suspicion than one carried by either principal, and because Albert, more than anyone, had the particular gift of being trusted quickly by men wary of being managed. Cyrus Hargrove listened to the whole account in his own yard, his son Nathaniel beside him with his jaw tight and his color rising as the tale unfolded, and when Albert finished, Cyrus was quiet a long moment before he spoke. "I've bought seed and rope and nails from Silas Rourke for 11 years, Cyrus said. "Never loved the man, but never thought him a snake either. If this is true, it's true," Nathaniel said, cutting in, and something in his face had changed since the last time Albert had seen him. The hot anger banked now into something colder and more useful. "I saw one of those drifters myself, 3 weeks back, riding a bay gelding with a Missouri-set shoe, exactly like the Smith describes, camped up near the old line shack on the Ridge Road. Thought nothing of it at the time. Figured him for a logger between jobs." "The old line shack," Albert repeated. "Is it still standing? Falling in on itself, but standing, yes." "Then that's where we start looking for proof," Albert said, "before Rourke thinks to clean it out." They rode for it that same afternoon, 5 of them together, Albert and Danny from the Ellsworth side, Cyrus and Nathaniel Hargrove and one of their hands, a joint party such as had not ridden together on that Ridge Road in longer than anyone could easily remember. And the line shack, when they reached it, gave up its secrets without much resistance. A torn ledger page half burned in the cold hearth but not fully destroyed, listing payments in a cramped hand that Cyrus Hargrove recognized at once as Silas Rourke's own, dates that matched exactly to the nights of the fence cutting, and a name, Ike Bratcher, beside 3 of the payments, a name Nathaniel confirmed belonged to the very drifter he'd seen on the bay gelding. "That's enough to bring to the sheriff," Cyrus said, holding the scorched page carefully as though it might crumble to nothing if handled wrong. "Not enough to hang him, maybe, but enough to make the county take notice and enough to bring pressure to bear." But proof, as it turned out, traveled slower than fear, and Silas Rourke, whatever else he was not a stupid man. Word reached him within a day, through some hand or clerk loyal enough to carry tales, that both ranches were riding together now, that a ledger page had been found, that a boy had overheard him in his own storeroom, and a man who has built his fortune on other men's desperation does not simply fold his hand and walk away when the cards turn against him. He does what such men have always done when cornered. He reaches for the one tool left that no ledger can contradict, no witness can easily survive to speak against. The wind had been building for 3 days, dry and hard out of the east, the kind of wind that old-timers in the valley called a testing wind, because it tested every dry thing left standing after a long, brilliant autumn that had, for all its beauty, laid down weeks of tinder-dry grass and fallen leaf across every unburned acre from the river bottom to the ridge line, and every soul who had lived through a Cascade autumn before knew that such a wind, sooner or later, brought either rain or fire. And there was no telling in advance which would come first. It was fire that came first. Albert smelled it before he saw it, a bitter edge under the wood smoke he had grown so used to that he no longer noticed it, riding out to the Ellsworth ranch in the gray hour before dawn 2 days after the line shack discovery. He came around the last bend in the timber road and saw the glow low against the eastern sky where there should have been only the coming sunrise. A wrong color, orange bleeding up through smoke. And he put his heels to the mule and did not slow again until he reached the ranch yard. Elsie was already outside, already dressed, already shouting orders to a half-roused crew, and the sight of her standing in that yard with the fire glow behind her, calm even as chaos gathered around her, struck something in Albert's chest that had nothing to do with the danger and everything to do with the particular courage of a woman who did not wait to be told what to fear. "It's along the old boundary timber," she said, the moment Albert was close enough to hear. "Started in the dry slash near the line shack, from what Danny rode back to tell me not 10 minutes ago, and this wind is driving it straight toward both our home places and the timber yard above the ferry landing besides. If it jumps the creek bottom, we lose the bunkhouse, the barn, everything." "Rourke," Albert said, and it was not a question. "Rourke or Bratcher on his orders, burning out the evidence and taking the whole valley down around it if that's what it costs him," Elsie said. "There's no time to hunt the man who lit it. There's only time to stop what he lit." What followed was not the work of guns or fists, though a lesser story might have wanted it to be. It was the work of shovels and plow blades and wet burlap sacking, of every hand from the Ellsworth Ranch and every hand from the Hargrove Ranch and half, the men of Cedar Falls itself riding up from the ferry landing with buckets and axes. Because a fire in that valley threatened not one family's pride but every family's home, and old feuds burned away faster than dry grass once real flame showed itself on the ridge. Elsie took command of the effort the way she had once commanded a kitchen through a cattle drive's worth of hungry men, sharp and clear and utterly without hesitation. And it was a testament to what the valley had already learned of her in these past weeks that no one, not even Cyrus Hargrove's proud old hands, thought twice about following her orders now. "We cannot outrun this fire on the ground it's already got," she called out, standing on the wagon bed where everyone could see and hear her, smoke already thickening the light around them into a strange brown dusk, though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. "We are going to cut it off before it reaches us. Garrett, take 6 men and the plow team, cut a firebreak line from the creek bend to the old orchard, wide as you can manage, clear every stick of dry grass and brush down to bare dirt. Cyrus, if your crew will lend their plow blades besides, we'll cut it twice as fast." "You'll have them," Cyrus Hargrove said, without a heartbeat's hesitation, and something passed between the widow and the old rancher in that moment that closed, finally and completely, whatever suspicion had lingered between their two houses. "Nathaniel, Albert, I want you both up along the break line with wet sacking, beating down any spark that jumps ahead of the plow before it catches. Danny, you and the other boys are running water buckets up from the creek, and I don't want to hear one word of argument about you being too young for it, because I need every hand, however small, and I need it now." Albert had fought fire before, once long ago, in a different life he did not speak of, and the memory of it rose in him now not as fear but as useful knowledge, the particular rhythm of it, the way a man had to work with the wind rather than against it, the way a backfire, set with care against the main blaze's own hunger, could rob it of fuel before it ever arrived to claim what it had come for. "We need a backfire," he said, finding Elsie again through the smoke, close enough now that he did not have to shout. "The break line alone won't stop it if the wind holds this hard. We need to burn a strip ahead of the main fire, controlled before it gets there, so there's nothing left for it to feed on when it arrives." "That's a dangerous game if the wind turns on us," Elsie said, but she was already weighing it. He could see the calculation moving behind her eyes, the same swift, honest reckoning she brought to every decision that mattered. "It's a more dangerous game not to," Albert said. "I've seen a break line alone fail to hold, ma'am, more than once. Give me 4 men and I'll set it clean, working from the creek out, and I'll answer for it if it goes wrong." "You won't answer for it alone," Elsie said. "I'm coming with you." They set the backfire together along 100 yards of dry grass between the creek and the advancing edge of the main blaze, working with wet sacks and shovels to control its spread, feeding it just enough to burn hot and fast through the tinder before the main fire's own wind-driven fury could arrive to claim the same ground. And it was hard, filthy, frightening work. Ash raining down around them like some black and terrible snow, the roar of the approaching fire audible now even over the wind. But it worked exactly as Albert had promised. By the time the main blaze reached the burn strip, it found nothing left to feed it, and its terrible forward hunger stumbled, faltered, and began, at last, to die back along that edge even as it still raged elsewhere. It was not enough alone. The fire had jumped in 2 other places along its front, driven by gusts nobody could predict. And for 2 hours more the whole valley's worth of hands fought it with shovel and wet sack and sheer stubborn refusal to let it win. Garrett Voss working the plow line until his hands bled through his gloves. Cyrus Hargrove beating out spot fires alongside men who 3 weeks before he had been ready to accuse of murder. Danny running water buckets until his arms shook. And through it all Elsie Ellsworth moved along every line of the fight, never resting, calling encouragement, redirecting hands to wherever the danger flared hottest, until even the fire itself seemed to recognize it had met something it could not simply burn through. And then, as the light began to fail into a true evening rather than the false brown dusk of smoke, the wind that had driven the fire for 2 long days finally broke, and turned, and brought with it, sweeping down off the high peaks where it had been gathering unseen and unheeded through all those brilliant, deceptive autumn days, the first cold, hard rain of the season. It came suddenly, in the way mountain rain in that country always did, as though the sky itself had simply decided the argument was over, and every soul on that fire line stood for a moment in stunned silence as it hammered down around them, hissing against embers, turning ash to black paste beneath their boots. And then someone, one of the Hargrove hands, let out a whoop of pure relief that broke the spell, and within moments the whole exhausted crowd of them, Ellsworth and Hargrove and Cedar Falls townsfolk together, were laughing and shouting in the downpour with the particular delirious joy of people who have just watched disaster turn aside from their door. Elsie Ellsworth stood at the edge of the burned strip, soaked through in moments, her hair come loose from its pins and plastered to her face, streaked with soot and rain in equal measure. And when Albert found her there, equally filthy, equally soaked, something in the sight of her, laughing despite the exhaustion plain in every line of her body, undid whatever careful restraint he had kept wound tight around himself for 3 long weeks of watching her and telling himself it was not his place to want what he wanted. "We held it," Elsie said when she saw him, breathless, half in disbelief. "Albert, we held it." "You held it," Albert said. "Every order you gave tonight was the right one." "I couldn't have held anything without every hand on this line following those orders," she said. "Yours most of all. That backfire idea saved this whole valley's worth of homes, and you never once asked me whether I trusted you enough to try it." "Didn't seem like the moment to ask permission," Albert said. "Seemed like the moment to act and answer for it after." "You keep doing that," Elsie said, closer now than he had quite realized, rain running down between them, the fire's last dying glow throwing strange orange light across her soot-streaked face. "Following an order before anyone else moves, or acting on your own judgment when there's no time to ask, and never once asking anything for yourself in return." "Maybe I don't know how to ask," Albert said, and it came out rower than he intended, some old guarded door in him creaking open despite everything he had trained himself over 3 careful years not to let show. "Then let me ask instead," Elsie said, and closed the last distance between them, and kissed him there in the rain and ash with the fire dying at their backs and the whole exhausted valley cheering somewhere behind them. And Albert Covington, who had spent 3 years believing himself a man built for solitude, standing at the edge of towns rather than inside them, found that he wanted, more fiercely than he had wanted anything in a very long time. To be kissed exactly this way, by exactly this woman for the rest of whatever years he had left to live. It did not last, that kiss, more than a handful of trembling seconds before Elsie pulled back, and when she did there was uncertainty plain on her face, not regret, but a kind of startled honesty, as though she had surprised herself as much as him. "I don't know what that was," she said. "I don't make a habit of kissing hired hands in the rain, Mr. Covington, whatever this valley might now believe of me." "I don't make a habit of being kissed," Albert said, "so I suppose we're square on strangeness." "I meant what I said weeks ago," Elsie said, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold now that the fire's heat no longer reached them. "I need the whole truth from a man before I can trust him with anything more than my orders on a fence line. I've buried one husband already, Albert, and I did it not knowing everything I might have known, and I promised myself I'd not walk into anything again, not marriage, not this, not whatever this is between us, without knowing the whole of a man first." "Then ask me," Albert said. "Tonight, I'll tell you." They walked back toward the ranch house together through the last of the rain, and in the kitchen, while the rest of the exhausted crew found what dry blankets and hot coffee could be found for them in the bunkhouse, Albert Covington told Elsie Ellsworth the truth he had carried 3 years without speaking it to another living soul. "I wasn't always a blacksmith," he said, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands rather than looking at her, "because it was easier that way. Before I came out to this territory, I rode for a cattle baron in Wyoming, a man named Elias Foss, who paid better than any honest work I could find and asked fewer questions than any honest employer ought to. I was young and I needed the wage, and I told myself the work was just riding fence and moving stock, same as any ranch hand does. But Foss was fighting a range war with a smaller outfit that had settled water rights he wanted for himself, and the work turned uglier than fence riding a little at a time, the way such things always do, until one night he sent a crew of us to burn a barn belonging to a homesteader who wouldn't sell out, meant only to scare the man off his claim. I was there. I held a torch same as the others. I told myself I never meant harm to come of it, only fright. But the wind that night was worse than any of us judged, and the fire took the house alongside the barn before anyone could stop it, and the homesteader's wife died trying to get back inside for something she couldn't bear to lose. The kitchen was very quiet. Rain still fell steady against the window glass. "I didn't strike the match myself," Albert said. "I've told myself that 1,000 times since, like it might matter to anyone but me. But I stood there with a torch in my hand and did nothing to stop what I could see coming, and a woman died for it, and I have never once in 3 years since believed myself entitled to call that anything but my own guilt to carry. I left Wyoming inside a week, changed nothing about my name, because I hadn't the courage even for that much cowardice, but I never went back, never rode for another man's range war again, learned smithing from an old German fellow in Montana who asked no questions and taught patiently, and came west to Cedar Falls because it was as far from Wyoming as I could get without falling into the ocean. I've spent 3 years since telling myself that quiet, careful work with iron was a fair penance for a woman's life I helped take, even if I never meant to take it. I don't know that it's enough penance. I don't know that anything would be. But that's the whole truth of what I am, Elsie, and I understand now if it's more than you're willing to build anything upon." Elsie was silent a long while, long enough that Albert made himself look up from the coffee cup and meet whatever was in her face, because he owed her that much honesty too, to see whatever judgment she chose to render rather than hide from it. What he found there was not the rejection he had braced for. "You've carried that alone for 3 years," she said, quietly. "Yes, ma'am. And tonight, on that fire line, when you told me a backfire was the only way to save this valley's homes, and there was every chance the wind could have turned it against us same as it turned against that homestead in Wyoming, you said it anyway, and you said it right, and you stood in the worst of that danger yourself rather than send other men into it first. I couldn't ask any man to do a thing I wasn't willing to do myself. Albert said. "Not after Wyoming. I promised myself that much at least." "Then you've spent 3 years paying a penance nobody but yourself ever demanded of you, for a wrong you didn't strike the match on, and gave everything you had tonight to make sure never happened again on your watch," Elsie said. "I won't tell you the guilt isn't yours to feel, Albert. I think a man who felt nothing over a woman's death would be a man not worth trusting at all. But I don't believe guilt carried alone for 3 years does anybody any good, least of all the man carrying it, and I don't believe the truth you just told me is a reason to think less of you. If anything, it's the opposite. You told me the worst thing you've ever done, unasked for, unforced, because I said I needed the whole truth before I could trust you, and you gave it to me even knowing it might cost you everything you'd started to build here. That's not the mark of a man I ought to turn away from, Albert Covington. That's the mark of exactly the kind of man I've been afraid to hope still existed." "Elsie, I'm not finished," she said, and there was the smallest tremor of her own uncertainty in it now, a fairness demanded of herself as much as offered to him. "I have my own truth to give you since I've asked so much of yours. I have been afraid, since Thomas died, of needing anyone the way I needed him, because losing that once nearly broke me, and I built this ranch back up these past 14 months telling myself I could do it alone, that I didn't need a man's help or a man's love to prove I was capable of running what I'd been left. And then you came riding up my lane with Warren bleeding in your cart, and you followed every order I gave without ever once making me feel small or foolish for giving them. And somewhere in these past weeks, I stopped being able to imagine running this ranch, or living this life, without you somewhere near the middle of it. I don't know what that makes either of us tonight, soaked through and exhausted and covered in soot in my kitchen. But I know I don't want to pretend I didn't feel what I felt out there in the rain, and I know I'd rather build something honest and uncertain with you than something safe and lonely without you." They did not decide everything that night, sitting at that kitchen table while the rain finally slackened outside, and the exhausted valley slept off its fear in whatever dry corner it could find. But something had been settled between them all the same, a foundation laid as sure as any Albert had ever built with hammer and iron, and when he rode back toward Cedar Falls in the gray hour before dawn, he found himself smiling into the last of the rain in a way he had not allowed himself to smile in 3 long, careful years. The matter of Sela's work was settled within the week, though not without one more confrontation that tested every ounce of the alliance the fire had forged. Word of the burned ledger and the fire's true origin had spread through the valley faster than the fire itself had spread through dry grass, and Rourke, cornered on all sides, tried first to bluster his way clear, claiming the ledger page proved nothing, that any man might have set that fire out of simple carelessness with a campfire in dry conditions, that Ike Bratcher was a drifter he'd hired for honest freight work and knew nothing else about. But Cyrus Hargrove and Elsie Ellsworth rode into Cedar Falls together, side by side, an alliance the whole town could see plainly for what it was, and presented their evidence not to Rourke but to the county sheriff, a steady, unhurried man named Del Whitcomb, who had ridden up from the county seat 3 days after word reached him by ferry courier of a wildfire in the valley and rumors of arson behind it. Warren Michaels gave his account of the brass-buttoned coat. Danny gave his account of the storeroom conversation, plainly and without exaggeration, a boy's honest memory holding up well under the sheriff's careful questioning. And Albert Covington, called to testify to the matter of the horseshoe print, gave his professional judgment of the Missouri nail pattern with the same quiet certainty he brought to every piece of work at his forge. Ike Bratcher himself, found within 2 days hiding in a logging camp upriver and brought back under the sheriff's custody, proved, in the end, no braver in defense of his employer than most hired men are when facing a rope for another man's scheme. He confessed the whole of it within an hour of his capture: the fence cutting, the false trespass with the driven cattle, the fire set on Rourke's direct order to destroy the evidence of both, and named Rourke plainly as the man who had paid him for every part of it. Silas Rourke was arrested at his own mercantile counter, still protesting his innocence to a store full of witnesses who had, by then, heard enough of the truth to no longer believe him. And the notes he had held over both the Ellsworth and Hargrove ranches were found, upon the county's examination, to have been altered more than once in his own favor beyond what either family had ever actually signed. Fraud enough on its own to see him facing years in the territorial prison at Walla Walla, even before the arson charge was added atop it. Garrett Voss stood in the crowd outside the mercantile the day Rourke was led away in irons to await the circuit judge, and afterward he found Elsie in the yard of her own ranch and took off his hat in a gesture more formal than any he had offered her since her husband's death. "I owe you more than one apology, Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, plain and unhappy in the way of a proud man forcing honesty on himself. "I doubted your judgment near every week since Thomas passed, and every time you proved yourself right, and I told myself it was luck rather than sense, because I didn't want to admit a woman could run this outfit better than I'd have run it myself. I watched you hold that fire line steady when I half expected the whole valley to burn around us, and I watched you build an alliance with Cyrus Hargrove that likely saved both our outfits from ruin, and I've got no more excuse left for the way I've treated your orders these past weeks." "You stayed, Garrett," Elsie said. "Whatever your doubts, you stayed and you worked that plow line until your hands bled. That counts for more with me than any apology." "I'd like to keep staying," Garrett said, "if you'll have a foreman who's learned, finally and at considerable cost to his own pride, to trust his boss's judgment even when it doesn't match his own instincts." "I'll have him," Elsie said, gladly, and something eased in both of them that had been tight and unresolved since the very first morning Elsie had given an order Garrett hadn't wanted to follow. The valley settled, in the weeks that followed, into a new and steadier shape. Cyrus Hargrove and Elsie Ellsworth signed a joint agreement on the shared boundary fence, splitting the cost of its repair and pledging cooperation should trouble of any kind arise again. And Nathaniel Hargrove, chastened by how close his own temper had come to starting a war that would have served no one but Silas Rourke, took to riding over some Sundays to sit with Danny and teach him roping tricks, an unlikely friendship neither of them had expected, but both seemed glad enough to keep. Warren Michaels healed fully, the shoulder stiff in cold weather ever after but otherwise sound, and stayed on as one of the Ellsworth ranch's steadiest hands, proud, in his quiet way, of having been the first thread pulled that unraveled Rourke's whole scheme. And Albert Covington found himself, as the last of the autumn color gave way to the bare gray branches of true winter approaching, standing in his own smithy one evening turning a small piece of iron in his hands, not a horseshoe or a hinge but something smaller, more deliberate, a plain band he had shaped himself over 3 careful evenings, when Danny came in from the ranch with a message that Mrs. Ellsworth would like him to come to supper if he had the time. He had the time. He rode out to the ranch through the early dark of a winter evening come sooner than the calendar strictly allowed, the first hard frost of the season silvering the grass along the road, and found Elsie on the porch waiting for him, as she so often did now, though tonight there was something particular in the way she watched him dismount, something that told him she had guessed, or hoped, at what he carried in his coat pocket. "I've been thinking," Albert said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps because his nerve, steady enough in a burning field or a sheriff's inquiry, seemed to have deserted him entirely now that it mattered most, that a man can be 2 things after all if he's careful about it, and if he's got the right reasons to manage both. "Is that so?" Elsie said, coming down 2 of the steps toward him, arms crossed against the cold, though her eyes gave away far more warmth than the gesture suggested. "I could keep the smithy," Albert said. "Cedar Falls needs it and I've grown fond of the work and fond of the town besides. But I don't want to keep riding back to an empty room above it every night, not when there's a ranch 4 miles out with a kitchen that smells better than any meal I've cooked myself in 3 years, and a boy who needs steadier people around him than a bunkhouse crew can always manage alone, and a woman in it who I have come, somewhat against my own careful nature, to love more than I know how to say plainly." "Then say it plainly anyway," Elsie said, close enough now that her breath showed pale in the cold between them. "I find I've grown rather fond of your plain way of saying things, Albert Covington." "I love you," Albert said, and it came out easier than he had feared, once he simply let it. "I love you, and I love this valley you've taught me to belong to, and I would like, if you'll have me, to marry you, and to raise that boy up there on your porch step eavesdropping shamelessly as if he were my own, and to spend whatever years I've got left proving to you every single day that the truth I gave you in your kitchen was the last secret I'll ever keep from you." Danny, indeed, was leaning around the porch post with no pretense of subtlety whatsoever, grinning so wide it seemed likely to split his face. "I heard him say a thing," he announced to no one in particular, "and I aim to be there when she says one back." "Hush, Danny," Elsie said, though she was laughing even as she said it, and then she looked back at Albert with all the steady, clear-eyed certainty that had first made him follow her orders without question on the very morning they met. "Yes, I'll marry you, Albert Covington. I required the whole truth of you before I'd trust you with anything more than a fence line, and you gave it to me freely, at real cost to yourself, and I have never once regretted asking. I don't intend to start regretting it now." They married 3 weeks later, in the last mild days before the true winter rains set in for good. A small ceremony held in the Cedar Falls Church with half the valley crowded into pews built for a congregation half that size, Cyrus Hargrove and his son among them, Garrett Voss standing witness for Albert with a gruff pride he did his poor best to hide, and Danny, scrubbed and combed within an inch of his patience, standing at the front in a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large. Because Elsie had asked him, formally, whether he would like to come live at the ranch house proper from now on, as their own, rather than in the bunkhouse with the hired hands, and Danny had cried for the first time. Anyone at the ranch had ever seen, and said yes before she had even finished asking. Albert kept the smithy, as he had said he would, hiring on a young apprentice from among the logging camp's spare sons to mind it through the mornings, so that his own hours could be split more easily between forge and range. And the town of Cedar Falls, which had feared for a season that it might lose its smith to a ranch 4 miles out, found instead that it had gained, in the bargain, a blacksmith more settled and more certain of his place in the world than it had ever known him to be. The valley itself healed the way land does, slowly and without much ceremony, the burned strip along the old boundary growing back green and stubborn by the following spring, the alliance between the Ellsworth and Hargrove ranches holding firm through the winter and beyond, strengthened rather than weakened by the fire they had fought together, and Silas Rourke's mercantile passed, after his conviction, into the hands of a fair-dealing family from Seattle who charged honest prices and extended honest credit, so that the whole valley breathed a little easier every time they walked through its doors. On the evening of the first real snowfall that winter, Albert Covington stood at the window of the ranch house he now called home, watching the flakes come down soft and steady over ground that had, only months before, been scorched black and desperate, and felt Elsie come to stand beside him, her shoulder against his arm, her hand finding his without either of them needing to reach far for it. "Warm enough?" she asked, the same practical question she asked every hand on the place at the first snow, and Albert laughed, low and easy, a sound that had grown far more natural to him in these past months than it had ever been in the 3 careful years before. "Warmer than I've been in longer than I can rightly remember," he said, and meant it entire, the whole truth of it, freely given, the way he intended to give her every truth he had left to offer for as many winters as they were given together. Outside, the snow fell soft and silent over the mended fence lines and the healing timber, over the ranch house windows glowing gold against the dark, over a valley that had nearly torn itself apart on a stranger's greed and had instead found, in the fighting of a common fire, the makings of a lasting peace. And inside, in the warm kitchen where a widow's leadership and a blacksmith's quiet devotion had first found each other, Elsie Ellsworth and Albert Covington stood together and watched the first snow of their first winter as husband and wife, certain, at last, of exactly where they belonged,